I thought what I'd like to do is to start with you giving me an outline, really, of your background and career and what brought you into the digital space and what brought you to the Met ultimately, and we'll take it from there. So that's quite a lot, I realise.
I'll try and keep it brief.
Okay, thank you.
Um, hi, my name is Sofie Andersen. I head up the digital content and editorial team at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. I have been working in media and interpretive media for over 20 years in the cultural heritage and museum sector. I started out as a young graduate from the Courtauld Institute in art history. I was very, very passionate about visual arts and museums. And in going into this field, I was at a time where, this was sort of pre-digital. So I was very much working in a space where museums were really, I think, sort of at the beginning of thinking about how to really reach audiences, particularly on site at that time. I came up through actually a startup company called Arts Communication Technology, and they were creating CD-ROMs at the time to walk around with in museums,
Yes.
and the sort of first random access experiences. And when I joined the company, they were in the middle of working on a new product, which was an MP3 player, which of course, now it's like old hat, but at the time was
Yes.
pretty innovative technology some 20 years ago. And so I actually came up through the technology part of that company, and I was really interested in how this new kind of experience would help to democratize the experience. I think random access was that beginning of that idea that you could choose whatever you wanted, choose your own adventure in museums.
Yes.
And that really appealed to me because I felt that people really they want guidance, but they also want to be able to choose where they're going and what they feel like doing when they want to do it. I moved over to the production side of the company and spent really the next 15 years working to create interpretive experiences. I was creating theatrical audio tours for Stirling Castle. I was creating multilingual tours for the Hong Kong Museum of Art. I created the first thematic tours at the National Gallery in London, and I did a series of accessibility tours for the National Museum in Denmark, which is an anthropological museum. So I really came up very broadly through the museum and cultural sector, thinking about how to engage audiences on site with different kinds of storytelling, and really experimenting with how to broaden up the different kinds of voices you could have in the space. Um, and I was lucky enough early in my career to be offered the opportunity to move to New York and to head up the New York office of this company, which happens to be based out of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. We were doing so much work for the Met that we actually had our own offices at the Met. And so I really kind of expanded my art history education by, tenfold by working at the Met for 10 years, actually, creating a number of different again, sort of thematic tours, exhibition programs, really introducing for the first time an interview-based experience within the museum. And at the same time, because I was working for this organization, I worked for the Guggenheim and LACMA. I set up the first audio tours down in South America. So a great many experiences. And during this time, the field really evolved, and we started to develop apps rather than audio technology for people to take. We got into podcasting, so I really started to evolve as the field was evolving and started to learn more about how to really bring media experiences online and away from sort of the on-site experience. And that took me into a research phase. So I actually went into more digital strategy and research, looking at accessibility tools for audiences. And again, this is a huge period of growth within that field, to be able to reach blind and partially sighted audiences using mobile technology, and also looking at how to really think about co-creating with our audiences, not just making something and putting something out, but how to really create that content together. that led me to working at the Whitney Museum. So I headed up the digital media department at the Whitney for a few years. And it was just after they'd moved downtown to their new building. And they were really thinking about how do we introduce ourselves really to a new audience. They had, had a pretty steady audience up on the Upper East Side, but suddenly they were talking to tourists. They were talking to a lot more international audiences than they had previously. And so we started to do a lot of storytelling about what is the Whitney Museum, what is the Whitney Biennial, why American art, what does that American art mean? It was a really interesting period in terms of just kind of recalibrating how to tell stories for audiences. We also rethought how to deliver technology to our audiences on site. We had a traditional audio guide for some years, a sort of at that point a handheld phone, and we developed a progressive web app, which really meant that we could create a totally frictionless experience for our audiences. So you could come in, you didn't have to download anything. You basically take your phone, scan a QR code easily, which most phones have them either built in through their cameras or through, through their a quick QR code reader, and you're able to access, the museum's content, whether it's audio or video, also event programs, kind of directly to your phone without having to download anything. We know in the sector that downloading is just a huge barrier to actually using these kind of experiences.
Yes.
So that took me to my last 18 months, almost 2 years at the Met. I actually came on as head of content, but very shortly afterwards took on an interim role as CDO. So I've been doing that for the last 18 months. I've just transitioned back into the head of content role. But as CDO, I really oversaw a period where within our team, we were thinking again a lot about storytelling. The Met's got amazing, rich content, but for many people, it's very overwhelming. What's my entry point? It's in a very traditional museum. It can be a little off-putting in some ways in that sense. So really trying to think about what's the human side of an institution like the Met? How do we really convey what it means to put these programs together? Why is cultural heritage, why is art important? Something like an encyclopedic collection, you can do so much in that area. And so I've really been working on that. And again, also thinking about the kind of nascent technologies, whether it's AR, whether it's progressive web apps, whether it's totally different kinds of experiences like primers that we've been developing that help people get a sort of a virtual experience before they come to the museum, or as for most people now, not at all. So it's been a long arc. I'm sorry, that was a long spiel.
No, that's great. That's fascinating.
Yeah, I think, for me, the foundation of kind of how I've gotten here is it really started with my experiences pretty early on as a child. Actually, growing up, I was living in the Danish Cultural Institute, which was where my dad was working.
I read that.
And it's a very kind of formative experience for me because I really was always surrounded by artists, by playwrights, by musicians, and art was not a separate thing that happened somewhere else. Art was really part of life. It's about cultural exchange, bringing people together. It's about expressive opportunities. It's about, escapism, but also connection. And so those kind of experiences are really formed for me that bedrock of why I'm so passionate about bringing culture to existing audiences and new audiences, and having it not just arrive, but then actually have an impact. What happens once you've been in an experience or seen a work of art.
Reaching new audiences is always a difficult thing, isn't it? There is an audience for museums and there's an audience for art galleries. How do you step outside that? How do you engage with new audiences?
I mean, I think that the biggest piece is getting people to museums or getting people to be interested. And I think for the longest time, the benchmark of success has been foot traffic through the door. How many people Can you actually get to arrive on your site? Because then you have the quote unquote real experience, and then you have all the revenue opportunities associated with that too. I think we have to think outside of that paradigm and really consider a visit as being much more than when you actually arrive. You have to really think about all the different ways in which you can connect across multiple platforms, whether that's YouTube or Pinterest or Instagram or Wikipedia. One of the things the Met has done an incredible job of, and that we've been working on, is taking an open access program. So that's making images available for anyone to download, and not just making it available and sort of saying, here, this is great, now you can do something with it, but creating an API, which basically means that other technologists can use the collection, and embedding that content in places like Wikipedia. So we run regular editathons where we are encouraging people to use our collection and integrate it into Wiki pages. And that's, again, about stepping outside of a kind of controlled environment of the museum. It's really saying the collection is what's important. The people that create the content is what's important. So let's make sure we get the collection and the content out there to as many different audiences and in as many different places as possible. So I think it's really that benchmarking of what is successful for a museum visit. Does it actually have to mean coming in the door, or can it mean something else? And I think once you change that, the possibilities of more people actually coming through your door actually also increase. So it's a benefit both ways.
That's incredible. You talked about the sort of choose your own adventure museum experience beginning.
Yeah.
And of course, how much is digital storytelling beginning to be driven by changing audiences, the way audiences are evolving into something less passive, and more like protagonists who want to drive their own adventure?
This has been such an interesting, I think, evolution over the last 10 years, is gaming and game theory kind of coming into museums. There's been so much kind of activity around that, and really great experimentation. And I think people have really been having a lot of fun with this. There's, a lot of attractions, I think, choosing sort of avatar type approaches to how you enter an experience. You're choosing a character or choosing a storyline. And I think that's super successful, particularly in sort of really immersive exhibition spaces and cultural heritage environments, where there isn't one way to tell the story. And actually, by doing that, sort of multiple approaches, you can encourage people to come back and next time choose a different character and all the rest of it. So I think that's hugely successful. I think that it's also a space that VR creators have been playing in. So this idea that you can introduce gaming through sort of totally immersive experiences, or even just the idea that you can be in a space and explore it as if you were in a game, and kind of go in different areas and kind of open different parts of the experience and get different kinds of content. So I think there's an extraordinary amount to keep exploring there. But I would say even in the more sort of traditional media of video and audio, I think and websites, I think there's more and more that is geared towards personalization. And that's sort of, within the digital sort of non-museum space, something that is, been growing and growing. And I think that's really important for museums to be tapping into, because where you arrive from when you come from anywhere else on the web to a museum's website informs why you got there, and you can turn that into something else. But I think it's an important understanding to figure out, what might you be interested in based on where you've come from. So I think there's a sort of whole gamut from the creative to the more sort of, sort of digital marketing-y side of it that's really important.
Yes, that's interesting. To what extent has this sort of digital innovation been affected by the pandemic? I think we've seen some positive changes as well as obviously negative ones.
Absolutely. So I think one of the ways in which at the Met we were particularly well set up for the pandemic was we had really focused on this idea that the virtual experience is as important as the online. So we have a tremendous amount of resources already on the website. There's a timeline of our history on the Met's website. It's been around since before Wikipedia. The online collection was already set up, but we'd also been creating a lot of connections outside of the website. So we've been putting our kids' content onto a Microsoft platform called Flipgrid, which is a place where students and teachers can go and create new content based on, a whole sort of marketplace of different assets. And so we put our Met Kids content on there. And, efforts like that just skyrocketed. We saw our engagement on Met Kids go way, way, way up as soon as the pandemic hit. And it's obvious, educators and families really looking for ways to kind of stay connected to culture and learning while having to do it remotely or in very different kind of situations around the world. Similarly, our experience of the timeline of art history went way up. Our audience really increased for that. But there are also ways in which productions that we had been in flux with before in early stages really surprised us. So we had created a series called Met Stories for the Met's 150th anniversary this year. And the idea was really to introduce different kind of voices into the perception of why museums matter. So not just, again, sort of telling of art history and told by experts and, all the rest of it. And artist perspectives, as important as they are too, but really kind of looking at more of a diaspora of perspectives. And that series has really, really hit a nerve. It's the most successful media series we've ever done at the Met. We're 3 million views already, and we're not even at the end of the series. And I think one of the reasons for that is that it's really human-based storytelling, and it's really getting into topics like resilience and essential kind of aspects of museums. It's talking about disability. It's talking about how it can be a hard space if you're a person of color or a curator of color. And so these are topics which I think really have resonated with both the pandemic, but also with the social racial justice work that's been happening, particularly in the US, but in many other parts of the world, the UK included. So I think it's sort of a combination of these different kind of aspects, things we were already doing, being in the right place, and also the kind of content that really resonates with people now. There's also very light-hearted things that have really resonated. We've created an integration with video game Animal Crossing. I don't know if you've heard of that, yes, but it's again another sort of avatar space. And that was really a very quick integration, took advantage again of our open access setup, where now there's a QR code and you can really just integrate very quickly an artwork from the collection into your Animal Crossing world. And that saw that was a huge success. So, huge audiences coming to our online collection that weren't coming before. We got massive droves of people from Japan, perhaps not surprisingly, because, it's a big game out there. So, I think there's certainly aspects to this which are about what we've had in place, what we kind of were surprises, and how we've taken advantage of this moment.
How can we move forward? How do you see it developing in the future? Will it carry on this development, do you think?
I mean, I think what's interesting is that where digital was always, I think, understood as being important, I think now it's really essential. Now there's really no way back to saying you have to have a real strategy for how you not just do a sort of parallel experience to what you have at the museum. It's not enough to have an exhibition page and a nice video. It's really about how do you actually experience the museum, both within your kind of digital experiences online, and then also kind of wider out in the world. I think there are some ways in which, again, our education programming, I think, will probably see a really dramatic shift. The idea that most education programs, certainly in the US, have gone online. We have virtual events now, and it's really been a revelation. People have, I think, grown a comfort level with doing this kind of thing that we're doing now, virtual interviews and panel talks and large Zoom workshops and things like that, which I think that's a development that will stay. Hopefully we'll be back on site doing more programming before too long. I still think the in-person experience you can't beat it in terms of social connection and, just being together with people is great, and we all really miss that a lot. But I think that kind of event-based programming virtually, I think, will definitely stay. I think there's also ways in which we've been experimenting with things like AR and both as kind of experiential but also educational. And I think that where that might have felt like a little bit further off and too kind of edgy, I think now people are kind of like, why not? You know, it's here. Let's play with it. I think that lowering of the threshold for kind of what makes sense digitally, I think has been really, really interesting. And I think that's a trend that will stay. And hopefully a little bit of digital savvy too, you know, people not being afraid to look at the data and see how that impacts, you know, what we understand about what people are doing. I think also the on-site experience, which we haven't spoken about too much, the big move that's been happening in the States in a lot of museums is really how do we think about very limited contact or contactless experiences. So we were talking before about progressive web apps. Well, that's, you know, that whole app sort of environment has been so tricky for museums to really be successful in, and heritage sites too. I think more and more are thinking about, you know, how do you make sure that your buildings are Wi-Fi enabled so you can do something lightweight on your mobile phones as you walk around. I think that's really going to be interesting. And I think these kind of experiences that allow you to be immersive in specific spaces in the museum, I think will also be a trend. I'm curious to see, though, too, I think there may be a little bit of a wanting to shed sort of technology a little bit when people initially return.
Yes.
I think a lot of people are going to be really grateful for getting away from their screens for a bit. So I sort of expect that initially people will feel like just being able to interact with, you know, whether you're going to a heritage site like a castle or a stately home, or whether you're going to a museum, I think people will just be really grateful to be able to kind of experience something. And I think the industry should really take advantage of that. I think that the welcome back moments that we should start to plan for now are really critical to reminding people just how how rejuvenating those can be, and restorative. And I think that's something we should be readying ourselves for.
I think that's fantastic. I'm going to ask you the ridiculous question now. What is the function of a museum like this in the modern world and into the future?
I think it's a really important question that we should all be asking. I mean, obviously the traditional idea of the museum is kind of as a caretaker and kind of this kind of connoisseurship, and really making sure that there's an understanding of why something is important or interesting, and why something is as part of the museum collection. I really see that paradigm shift of museums being kind of temples and areas of authority shifting into conveners. So I think that there's a lot of fear in the sector, and certainly I think there's been a little bit of maturity around this, but I think there's still a legitimate fear of, you know, how do you, in this environment, both media-wise and sort of across the landscape, really address the idea that authority is can be problematic in this moment. I think a lot of younger generations coming up are really like, what can I trust? What can I believe in? And I think setting museums and cultural sector sites up as being the authority, I think, has been a really safe space, and it's been a way of validating what people do. I think we need to think of ourselves as conveners of authorities and different perspectives, and bringing different ideas and different perspectives together, and being, if not safe spaces, because I think that word is kind of tricky, but spaces for that dialogue to be happening. And I think the more that we can place ourselves in that position, the better. And I think, going back to your question of what do I think the change has been, we can't any longer think of ourselves as being optionally relevant to audiences. We absolutely have to tie in our collections and our programming with the kind of topics and issues that people care about today. Absolutely. And I think that there's very few places that are not able to do that. And it doesn't have to be about kind of populism, as it were. It's really about saying, what are the core human concerns that people can really connect with? What are the ways in which we can learn from history? What are the ways in which we can be inspired and think about our own creativity when we look at great art? And I think that, again, I think that the idea that that was optional and kind of a nice to have, and maybe for young people, I think that's something that we really have to kind of just draw a line under and say it's non-negotiable. We have to be part of contemporary culture in order to be relevant, and in order to be not siloed off to the side. And again, I think in America, I'm thinking about this a lot because it's tied in with funding. Is this optional or is this essential? Do you need the art, is it something that's kind of a nice to have once everything else is in place? And obviously you never want to have an either or situation. And right now, the world is facing a health crisis and a massive economic fallout from that. And people really need homes and food and economics for survival. But I really do believe that the arts is a really foundational part of that economic survival, as well as, nourishment for our souls.
Absolutely. That's a fantastic answer. Thank you so much. This has been so valuable.